Welcome back. We've now traced 6 centuries of political economic thought, from mercantilism in the 15th century to monetarism and neoliberalism in our own time. In this lecture, we move from the history of ideas to the systems that countries actually run today. We'll compare the two great economic models of capitalism and socialism, and we'll look at the variance within each. Because in the real world, you'll find very few examples of pure capitalism or pure socialism. What you'll find are different mixtures and different emphases. Let's begin with capitalism. Capitalism is the economic system in which the means of production, factories, land, machinery, capital, are privately owned, and the allocation of goods and services is determined primarily through voluntary exchange in competitive markets. All scholars agree on these basic structural features. But capitalism as actually practiced varies enormously across countries and across historical periods, in the degree of government regulation, in the generosity of social provision, and in the extent to which market outcomes are modified through redistribution. The most thoroughgoing version of capitalism is laissez-faire capitalism, or free market capitalism. Laissez-faire holds that market outcomes should be entirely undisturbed by government intervention. This view rests on two pillars: a commitment to individual economic liberty as a value in itself, and a belief that free markets are capable of self-regulation and produce the best possible outcomes when left to operate spontaneously. Laissez-faire thinking developed in the 18th century, and it remains influential in contemporary libertarian and classical liberal thought. Neoliberalism, the dominant policy paradigm of the late 20th century, drew heavily on this tradition, though it typically accepted a larger role for government than strict laissez-faire doctrine would permit. Even the most market-oriented version of neoliberalism accepted the enforcement of property rights, the provision of national defense, and limited safety net provision. According to the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, the freest economies in the world as of 2024 are Singapore, Switzerland, Ireland, New Zealand, Luxembourg, and Taiwan. The United States ranks approximately 25th in the category of mostly free. Now, here's an interesting fact that's easy to miss. Several Northern European social democracies, including the Netherlands, Finland, and Denmark, rank consistently in the top 15. That tells us something important. A generous welfare state and competitive markets are not mutually exclusive, provided that the regulatory environment is otherwise market friendly. The assumption that more welfare means less freedom is empirically not quite right, which brings us to the next variant, the social market economy. The social market economy was pioneered in West Germany after World War II and adopted in various forms across Austria and the Scandinavian countries. It represents a middle way between laissez-faire capitalism and socialism. It accepts the market as the primary mechanism for allocating resources, but it supplements market outcomes with strong labor protections, comprehensive social insurance, active labor market policies, and systems of worker co-determination, in which employees actually participate in corporate governance. The German model, in particular, has been studied as an alternative to the Anglo-American model of shareholder capitalism. It tends to produce higher wages, lower inequality, and comparable levels of innovation and productivity. Different mix, similar bottom line. A third variant is state capitalism. State capitalism involves governments directing significant shares of investment through state-owned enterprises, through sovereign wealth funds, or through bureaucratic coordination of private investment toward national strategic priorities. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China have all practiced versions of state capitalism at various stages of their development. China's model has attracted particular attention. China combines a nominally socialist political system with a market economy that is subject to pervasive state guidance and intervention. The combination of rapid economic growth with authoritarian political control has challenged a widely held assumption from the 1990s, the assumption that economic liberalization necessarily leads to political democratization. The Chinese experience suggests that the relationship between economic and political liberty is more complicated than that. Now, as of 2026, the lines between these variants of capitalism have blurred considerably. The United States, under both the Biden administration from 2021 to 2025 and the second Trump administration from 2025 to the present, has moved toward greater industrial policy, direct government investment in strategic sectors, semiconductors through the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, clean energy through the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, electric vehicles. These measures represent a partial departure from the neoliberal orthodoxy of the previous 4 decades, and they reflect a bipartisan recognition that market forces alone may not generate the industrial capacity and supply chain resilience that national security and economic competitiveness require. Some economists have described this shift as a return to a form of strategic capitalism or industrial policy that shares features with the developmental state models of East Asia. It's one of the most significant shifts in American economic policy in a generation. Now to socialism. Socialism is defined as an economic system in which the means of production are socially owned rather than privately held, and in which production is organized according to social need rather than private profit. The range of positions within the socialist tradition is vast. It extends from moderate social democracy, which accepts market economies while using progressive taxation and public provision to correct their distributional outcomes, all the way to revolutionary Marxism-Leninism, which sought the complete abolition of private property and the construction of a centrally planned economy under the leadership of a vanguard party. The utopian socialists of the early 19th century, Charles Fourier, Henri de Saint-Simon, Robert Owen, provided the first systematic critiques of capitalism's effects on workers. They proposed alternative models of communal production. Their plans for cooperative communities and planned production were dismissed as impractical by Marx and Engels, who coined the term utopian socialism precisely to contrast these moralistic schemes with their own claim to scientific socialism, a socialism grounded in the materialist analysis of historical development rather than in moral appeals to the consciences of the wealthy. Marx's economic theory of socialism, developed in Capital in 1867 and in his other works, held that the abolition of private property and the socialization of the means of production would do three things. First, it would eliminate exploitation. Second, it would allow production to be organized rationally according to human needs rather than according to profit. And third, it would eventually permit the state itself to wither away as class conflict became unnecessary. That was the vision. In practice, however, the socialist states that emerged in the 20th century, the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, were characterized by rigid bureaucratic planning, political repression, and chronic inefficiency, not by the emancipation and abundance that Marx had envisioned. There was a key theoretical challenge that planned economies could never quite answer. It was identified by the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises in 1920. Mises argued that rational economic calculation is impossible without market prices. Here's the argument. In a market economy, prices convey information about the relative scarcity of goods and resources. Prices coordinate the decisions of millions of producers and consumers automatically. When socialist planners abolish the price mechanism, they lose this information. They have no rational basis for deciding how to allocate scarce resources among competing uses. The result is chronic shortages of some goods, surpluses of others, and pervasive misallocation. The Polish socialist economist Oskar Lange attempted to answer this challenge through what he called market socialism, proposing to retain market prices for the exchange of raw materials while socializing the means of production. But market socialism faced its own theoretical and practical difficulties, and no stable, efficient socialist market economy has ever been demonstrated to work in practice. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, state socialism as an alternative to capitalism was largely discredited as a practical economic system. Countries that had been organized on the Soviet model, Russia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, the Baltic states, transitioned to market economies, though with highly variable outcomes in terms of growth, in terms of inequality, and in terms of democratic consolidation. As of 2026, only a handful of countries, North Korea, Cuba, and in a hybrid form Venezuela, maintain economies organized primarily on socialist principles. China, despite the continued political monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party, operates what is more accurately described as state capitalism, with extensive private enterprise, market prices, and deep integration into the global economy. And yet, despite the historical failures of Soviet-style central planning, socialist ideas have undergone a significant revival in democratic politics since the 2008 financial crisis. In the United States, the campaigns of Bernie Sanders and the rise of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, demonstrated that a significant minority of Americans, particularly younger voters who came of age after the fall of the Soviet Union and who associate the word socialism with Scandinavian social democracy rather than Soviet dictatorship, are open to a substantially expanded role for the state in healthcare, in education, in housing, and in the energy sector. In the United Kingdom, Jeremy Corbyn led the Labour Party on an explicitly socialist platform from 2015 to 2020. In Europe, Green and left parties have pushed for eco-socialist policies that combine the nationalization of energy infrastructure with ambitious climate targets. This democratic socialist revival does not represent a return to Marxist-Leninist central planning. It represents a reinvigoration of the social democratic tradition, a commitment to using democratic politics to substantially constrain and redistribute the outcomes of market capitalism. So those are the major economic models. Capitalism in its laissez-faire, social market and state capitalist variants, and socialism in its democratic and revolutionary variants. In our final lecture for this chapter, we'll look at the major challenges facing the post-World War II liberal economic order in the mid-2020s. I'll see you there. See